Small businesses and entrepreneurs are the lifeblood of economies around the world, and that's no different here in the UAE. That's why today I'm delighted that Dr. Ahmad Belhoul Al Falasi, the Minister of State for Entrepreneurs and SMEs, has joined us today on AB Talks to unpack the startup sector in the UAE and discuss what's next for the burgeoning entrepreneurs in the country. Dr. Ahmad, thank you for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So to start with then, broad-based question for you. Can you talk to me a little bit about the importance of the startup sector here in the UAE to the long-term growth of the country's economy?
Yes. So the SME sector is critical in any economy, let alone the UAE. The World Trade Organization estimates that SMEs globally are 90% of all registered companies. They account for 2/3 of global employment and over 50% of global GDP. And the UAE is no different. The UAE, 98% of all companies are SMEs. They account for about 60% of non-oil GDP. So they are at the core of the economy. And I think if you look at historically, the UAE has always been a trade hub. And on the back of that, we have big companies like Emirates, DP World, Masdar, and others. And today, we hope that the SMEs as well will go through that through. They go through globalization, start as a small company in the UAE, and then use that platform to become a hub and expand globally.
So, but what kind of challenges are specific to SMEs here in comparison to you're talking about other countries in the world, but also how is the ministry trying to address it and help the startup sector overcome the challenges?
So look, the ecosystem in the UAE is relatively more mature compared to the region. It's one of the most mature systems in the MENA region. However, it still has its teething problems. Initially, if you look at the first companies that were set up, there was an issue of access to funding. A lot of these companies are able to get the seed funding, the Series A, Series B, but then as you grow larger, you need that big ticket of 100 million, 200 million, so forth. If you look 5 or 10 years ago, people were much more skeptical to put that money on the table. But today, I think that ecosystem has evolved. We've seen companies like Kitopi last year close a huge round of funding. They were valued at over $1 billion, but it's one of the biggest fundings that we've had in the region. Not only that, but even at different stages, the amount of funding that goes into companies has almost tripled. So in seed investment, it went from half a million to 1.5 million. Series A also tripled from 3 to about 8 million. And Series B now is over 30 million. So we've seen maturity in the terms of availability of funding at late stage. But even within each stage, investors are much more comfortable investing bigger ticket items. And that grows to show the confidence of these companies. Again, funding continues to be an evolving topic for everyone, whether it's equity or debt. But I think I'm very positive from what I've seen. Over the past 4 years, the average total VC investment was hovering around $500 million. Last year alone, we closed over 1.2 billion. That's almost doubled. So again, it is an issue with any ecosystem, but for us, I think we are, years ahead from the region around us.
So this issue of funding, which is obviously extremely important for startups, is the answer here you're talking about much higher increased funding? Are we talking external funders coming to the UAE, or is it internal investment and the own ecosystem supporting itself?
Well, the ecosystem here is very interesting. It's very international. So the number of VC investors globally investing into the UAE from the outside is about 45%. If you look at the startups in the UAE who have received institutional investing, 42% of those actually were incorporated outside the UAE. So you have entrepreneurs in Amman and Beirut and Cairo and others who set up their company, but then moved into the UAE to get funding. So again, it's international startups moving into here, 42%. And in terms of funding, 45% of funding is from international VCs. So it's a highly international ecosystem. And as well, in terms of expansion as well, you've seen our startups expand into markets like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and India. And they're becoming far more international than they used to be.
So part of this internationality of the UAE startup ecosystem, how much of that has to do with the geographical position that the UAE has, and also to do with the regulatory frameworks that are in place and that you guys at the ministry are working on?
Yes. So look, I think, yes, it has to do with the location of the UAE. It also has to do with the demographics as well of the people here. So UAE is naturally very international. And I think the complexity of the regulation in the UAE would make it easier to expand. I had a friend of mine who had a company in law and insurance, and he told me he picked to start in New York because New York had the highest regulation. He said, if I can get funding, then I can grow there, then I can easily scale up in the US. So I can say the UAE is the same. So we're quite adamant about our regulation. And as you know, we're a federal and state level regulation. So you have to abide by so many regulations that once you overcome that, it becomes far more easier to expand. So entrepreneurs tell us all the time, we like that we have a strong base in the UAE, access to capital, access to talent is extremely important. We have 200 nationalities. The UAE has, for the 12th year, been ranked #1 in terms of place to work for within the MENA region. And again, being able to jump through the hurdles and then being able to expand is also something that entrepreneurs here might not like at the beginning, but they appreciate later on once they expand.
So they get the learning curve
Absolutely.
early on in the life cycle.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we've mentioned this word a couple of times already, entrepreneurs,
Yes.
right? So how do you go about encouraging entrepreneurism? I mean, obviously we have these top-down approaches here
Yes.
in the UAE, but obviously there needs to be bottom-up as well, right? So how are we seeing the development of entrepreneurs?
Well, look, the UAE is very interesting. So historically, it was all entrepreneurs, whether by sea or by land. But then came the onset of hydrocarbon wealth. And then we move into institutional labor market. And everybody's working here, expats and nationals alike. So with the comfort of that paycheck coming in month on month and being very secure, it becomes less enticing to go into a risky route.
Take a risk.
Exactly. But that has changed tremendously. We are still yet to work on that. So we do have 2 initiatives right now through the ministry with K-12. So we go to schools. We have about 1,200 students enrolled, where we actually have them take on CEO, CFO roles and get that entrepreneurial culture earlier on. In addition to the program with the university where they have a bidding competition, we have a proper panel, and then we actually invest in them. One of the interesting things, if you look at the US, which is very well known for being one of the best ecosystem globally, there's simple cultural things there that are embedded in people. So everybody knows the lemon stand story. Everybody knows the cookie seller, scout girl. These are embedded in the culture from when you are young, because that experience of having to sell a product as simple as lemon stand, choosing the location, choosing the pricing, being able to market yourself, being able to have enough inventory in time. That kind of mindset, even though we took it for granted, but we never had in the UAE. So being able to move from what profession we'd like to be when you grow up, asking them what kind of company would you like to create. So that's a big challenge we have, is around getting that culture earlier on. There is some good signs, but we've seen some over-romanticization of startups. We've seen everybody wants to be the next Kareem, the next Uber. Yeah. So it's a balance. You want to excite them, but using pragmatic exercises where you expose them to such experiences, and then that gets instilled in their mind.
Are we going to be seeing more lemon stands and cookie sellers here? Is that the kind of, we need that early stage development of entrepreneurism?
Yes, not specifically that, but I think something similar to that in the UAE. We are targeting students in years 8 to 10.
Young then, right?
Yes. And we're doing it in different ways. So in some cases, it's more of an investor mentality. So they have a theoretical investment to be made in equities, in digital assets. But then you also have the operational company where you actually start a business and they're giving some seed money. So we're trying to make it as realistic as possible so that when they come out of it, they've run from experience and understood that it's not that easy. As exciting as the sector may be, starting a business in that sector requires pragmatic skills, including interpersonal skills, because that CEO would have to hire his or her CFO, his or her chief marketing officer. So we really want them to go through the experience, the real experience of starting a company, and not only be fixated with the technical aspects of the market. The actual living and breathing of a company is not easy.
Mm-hmm. And how to have that entrepreneurial mindset, I suppose.
Absolutely.
So moving on to something more sector specific here, the UAE is already a hub for certain types of startups, such as, for instance, fintech is quite a hub here in the UAE and in Dubai in particular. What kinds of sectors are you seeing as further on the rise and furthering in terms of development, are seeing signs of becoming more mature and gaining additional capital?
So there are sectors that are naturally attractive to investors. Those are the high J curve. Things like fintech, consumer facing, any highly scalable business is extremely attractive to investors. And that is naturally the biggest share of funding. For us as a country, we'd like to focus on areas that are relevant to us, where we know that innovation can go a long way. So agritech is one of them, definitely. We're big investors in agritech. We promote it in a big way. There's an agritech valley being set up in Dubai. There's also water security. I was previously the CEO of Muster. We had a water desalination project based on solar power. After all, the region accounts for over 50% of global desalination. So there are some areas where the government is more bullish on because it solves for specific countrywide requirements. And then you have the market and investor demands. So I can still see fintech growing in a big way, consumer-facing technology going there in a big way naturally. But the government now is intervening through different metrics. So for example, at Emirates Development Bank, we will be launching an equity fund. And that equity fund will be funding the priority sectors, the things I talked about, healthcare, education, food security, and water. So we want to create a balance where we make it appealing to, okay, you can pursue your own entrepreneurial experience, but also we have these areas where the country is very bullish about, and we're willing to put more value on the table for you to be able to pursue that.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but it sounds like the argument you're making is that the startup sector is also here to help solve these big macro problems that you're looking at much further down the line in terms of things like water scarcity or agriculture and bringing agriculture here to the UAE. Do you think that's a correct summation?
Absolutely, because you have the market demand, right? So if the government has a demand for a certain vertical, then that naturally would be enticing entrepreneurs to solve for these issues. You have entrepreneurs who solve for a customer requirement, those who serve for a business like B2B, and I have B2G. There's a government requirement, a huge requirement that is very specific to the region. And you can also scale up because the issues here are the same, in the whole region. So yes, we are focused on specific sectors that we're very bullish about. But again, it's an ecosystem. So we'll still pursue the overall ecosystem health and maturity. So for example, the past 2 years, we've changed a lot of regulations. One of them was, decriminalization of checks. It was a big issue. You can't be an entrepreneur and have checks that bounce back and make you criminally liable. So remove that. And we've opened up ownership 100%. So we're tackling the wider ecosystem, but also specifically some sectors we have to put incentives where they're aligned with the government's interest.
So talking here about the last couple of years, I mean, for most of the world and for startups, it's been quite painful. We've seen, obviously funding was slashed in many countries around the world, but going full circle back to where we started, you were just telling us at the start of this conversation that funding was actually up here.
Yes.
So can you talk to me a little bit about how the UAE has achieved this? Is it the frameworks? Is it the fact that the UAE came through the pandemic relatively strongly in comparison to most of the rest of the world? What's driven the fact that the startups here and the startup ecosystem has developed well despite the fact we've had COVID-19?
Yes. So interestingly enough, I was appointed in July 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. And you can imagine how tough it was. The conversation I had were extremely difficult. But look, I constantly meet with entrepreneurs across different sectors. And the kind of discussions I had, let's say back in Q3, Q4 of 2020, were quite tough. I was being asked, why isn't the government in the UAE providing protection and paycheck protection plans and so forth? There were demands about securing and funding. But then in Q1 of 2021, the conversations changed dramatically because the government was able to invest heavily in healthcare. Today, we have the highest number of tests per capita, the highest number of vaccinations per capita. We're open for business. We've realized that 6 months down the line, entrepreneurs truly appreciate that much more that they're allowed to open their business. Obviously, there are changes in terms of COVID restriction, but you still are open for business. They prefer that over being shut down and being paid paycheck protection plans. That's one learning for us, I think. Fundamentally, that was the biggest, benefit the government gave. And we've seen as well a lot of multinational companies and entrepreneurs move into the UAE because of that, especially from the East as well, where it tends to be a bit more COVID zero policy. So that was the biggest achievement. But of course, there's the fundamentals of the markets. 390 billion dirhams were invested into the financial system. And that stimulus package is still active until June. So we've extended that as well. So I think it's a combination of securing the financial system, being able to operate is extremely important, gave a lot of confidence to not only the business, but also the consumers. We've seen tourist numbers here go incredibly high. We've seen conversions from tourists who came in for a visit that went on and bought properties. So I think really the COVID situation, the way the government has handled it, really gave a lot of confidence to everyone in the country, whether it's a tourist or entrepreneur or even a consumer.
So final thing from me then, I think, advice for the startup sector. You are the Minister of Startups and Entrepreneurism. What advice would you give to the startup sector and to entrepreneurs out there in the UAE?
Well, look, I think there's lots of potential. The UAE, from where I sit right now, is doing great. The system is maturing. We're extremely well connected. We are also signing agreements with different countries. We have the CEPA agreement, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement with India, that will open a lot of doors. We're also signing one with Indonesia and others. So besides the previous 10, 20 years, you need to understand that there'll be bilateral agreements with other countries that will make it much more easier to grow. So this is the land of opportunity, as we say, and I think everybody should take a stab at it and try starting their own business.
Well, on that very positive note, I'll thank you very much for your time, Dr. Ahmad. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.